Please be seated. I open this public session of the Doctoral Examination Committee of the Faculty of Religion and Theology. From the Christian origins of the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam to the polychromatic academic community that we are today, our scientific practice is intertwined with fundamental values and a sense of wonder. Prior to the examination, I invite the candidate to give a brief explanation of the research on which the dissertation is based. Please, Mr. Candidate, the floor is yours.
Dear Rector, dear audience, my dissertation is about the religious seeker theology. The process of preparing for this defense began around 1989, when for the first time I walked into a liberal church. I wondered, what do these people believe? And why do they believe that? Can I formulate in positive words what religious liberals believe? And later on, more specifically, what do religious seekers believe? And why do they believe that? All through this process, I had the feeling that something new was needed, that I could not find the answers to my questions in the courses I got in my theological and ministerial training. Therefore, the urge came up to create that something new myself. What I came up with is the topic of discussion at this defense. But what exactly is new? What is the new kind of theology that is needed? What new do I try to provide in my dissertation? And what does that mean for the positioning of my thesis in the field of theology? First of all, this is a theology for religious seekers. It is to improve the religious thinking of the millions of people who recognize themselves in my definition of religious seeking, to be inspired by more than one religious or wisdom tradition without committing to any one of them exclusively. But as such, this theology for religious seekers is not new. Many theologies address religious seekers. People who are assumed to still doubt, still hesitate about what to believe. These theologies are to provide answers that are that convincing and that enlightened that religious seeking is no longer needed. Even the Bible is full of this type of theologies. Thus, these are theologies for religious seekers, but at the same time aim to end the seeking process. And hence they do not take it serious. My aim is also to construct a theology for religious seekers, but to give a foundation for that seeking process, rather than to finish it. And that may be possibly new. Thus, my theology is not just a theology for seekers, it is also a theology of seekers. It's an apologetic theology, very much like Gordon Kaufman's. While Kaufman presents his theology to defend that people can be Christians in a well-considered contemporary way, I do the same for religious seekerism. It's an important conclusion of my thesis that religious seeking is not necessarily cheap, opportunistic relish shopping, but that it is possible to practice and ground that view in a very thoughtful and responsible way. In that way, my dissertation thinks through religious seeking, and in that sense, it's presenting something new. Something new, a new task, and in doing so, it is not surprising that I ran into new problems and had to find new ways out of them. The first problem is to find the proper base for a seeker theology. Many standard approaches in systematic theology do not work. Those standard ways use the normative sources the various religious and wisdom traditions provide us with. Holy scriptures, agreed as decided upon by a normative council, the statements of the founder of the tradition or their leaders. All these things are sources of inspiration for religious seekers, but religious seekers do not leave the final word to them. Therefore, they cannot be used as a starting point for theology. No, as I explain in chapter 5 of my thesis, the only final authority for seekers is their individual life experience. It is therefore that I have to start with what religious seekers actually believe. Therefore, I had to start from empirical studies. And although the amount of studies in that field is still quite limited, useful work was provided by the American scholar Linda Marquedante and by the Dutch Joantien Berghuis, who also got her PhD at this university. Attention should be paid to the word theology. The word literally means theologos, speaking about God. Seekers do not necessarily believe in God. Humanism and Buddhism, both traditions which inspire many seekers, do not use God as a central concept. Therefore, my theology is necessarily something different from speaking about God. But on the other hand, it is very much about that other well-known definition of theology, faith seeking understanding. And for that reason, my research very well fits in the theological tradition of Anselm of Canterbury. As all systematic and constructive theology, my theology does aim for a coherent faith, but a seeker faith rather than a Christian faith. Also, for that reason, it is broadening of what systematic theology is normally supposed to do. Other new aspect of my theology is instability. And in that sense, it also deviates from existing systematic and constructive theologies. Most existing theologies, even a liberal and enlightened theology, such as the one of Kaufman, aim at stability. If you see key theological concepts such as God or ultimate reality in a certain specific way, everything ends up well and safe. God with an exclamation mark, if you wish. My theology does not offer such a safe haven. Rather, it is based on the assumption that such a safe haven does not objectively exist. That means that for every theological topic, the question arises: should I aim at stabilization of that topic, or should I leave it open? While for other theologies, the default is stabilization, for my theology, it's the opposite. I aim as much as possible to keep topics unstable and open. God with a question mark as a central concept of my theology. That is because every stabilization comes at a price. For every topic you settle in the form of decisions and final claims, human wisdom that is contained in contradicting views is lost. However, this means that the question after stability itself is a very important topic to be dealt with in theology. Going back to the empirical studies of Mercadante and Berghuis, I find a number of topics which should be discussed in a theology for religious seekers. The method to discuss these topics is the one of constructive imagination, as introduced by Gordon Kaufman. For every topic, it is discussed whether it should be stabilized or left open. For ethics, religious interest, spiritual growth, truth, and religious diversity, I argue there is a reason to stabilize them. And for that reason, steps of faith are formulated, covering these topics and describing the seeker faith. For other topics, I argue sufficient theological reasons for stabilizing them are missing. For these topics, it might be better to leave them open, to ensure the possibility of maximum inspiration from all existing human wisdom. These are topics such as ultimate reality, key to the ultimate, inspiration, and afterlife. This openness, however, requires a new understanding of how to deal with religious diversity and all opposing insights the various religious and wisdom traditions provide us with. For that purpose, I propose aphoretic pluralism, an approach which is visualized by the art on the cover of my thesis. With this introduction, I hope to make clear that there are a lot of firsts in my thesis. In fact, it should be seen as a first scouting, a first attempt of scanning of the intriguing new field of constructive seeker theology. But that is not a reason to be soft on this work. It is my belief that religious seeker theology can only benefit from critical assessment of what I have constructed. It is therefore that I present my work with confidence and modesty, but most specifically with the hope that it will be sincerely and genuinely questioned and criticized. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Candidate, may I hear from you that you're ready to defend your thesis?
Rector, on your authority and as authorized by the College of Deans, and in accordance with the Doctoral Examination Committee in the Faculty of religion and theology, I am prepared to defend my thesis entitled Searching in Face of Mystery, in order to obtain the degree of doctor.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. For those of you here present, the people at this side of the table are not the only members of the committee and are not the only ones present. We have the co-supervisor, Dan McCannon, present through Zoom, and we have 3 of the opponents from the United States present through Zoom, and I will introduce them all to you at the allotted time. Then the opposition will begin with Professor Wim Drees, who is, among other positions, Professor Emeritus of Philosophy of Religion of Leiden University. Professor Drees, welcome back, I could say, to the Vrije Universiteit. It's good to have you here. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rector Magnificus. Esteemed candidate, on the authority of the Rector Magnificus and by virtue of my right, I would like to ask you some questions regarding the argumentative structure in the book, which is presented early in the book in a set of concentric circles and 6 steps. Before doing so, let me congratulate you on the completion of this book. I think it's an important topic. Actually, 2 books. There's also a smaller one in Dutch. I think it's nice to see a kind of engagement with Kaufman and trying to do it in a systematic way. I also have some disappointment. There are some issues in the English that I find disappointing and that I pointed out already in my earlier evaluation, like the beliefs, with as if it's a verb, but it's a noun, read, thread, where the text has read, and also the bibliography I find rather incomplete in how titles are presented. But anyhow, let me get to the substance. You present 6 concentric circles, and on the outside, people in general, and underneath it, it says overview of how the various steps lead from an agnostic starting point corresponding to all people in general. And that's what I am puzzled about. If I look around the world at all people in general, I hardly find any agnostics. Many are convinced believers in one or another tradition. So empirically, I can't really understand why you say it starts with an agnostic position. If one takes it philosophically, I'm not sure I can agree there. It may be somewhat similar to Descartes, who claims, well, I can doubt everything, but actually that has been highly original, but it's not really what he's doing. Or if a linguist wants to discuss languages, the person doesn't start from a linguistic point of departure. The person uses language to discuss languages. Isn't it far more plausible that agnosticism is a kind of final position rather than initial position? People start with all kinds of baggage, and that it's rather than construction, it's reconstruction. It's purifying your initial assumptions. So this emphasis on agnosticism, could you clarify that for me?
Learned opponent, thank you for this comment. Indeed, the interpretation in this way may suggest that I only start from a limited group of people who confessed agnosticism. That's not the idea behind the circles. I just start with my audience as an international audience without making any claims up front, and say, well, and then what I'm doing is every time asking, okay, I'm now going to make a claim. Can you still join me, or do you leave behind? So from that point of view, I have to start with the whole world, basically. And that is what I mean by a blank starting point. But that is not to mean that it is a agnostic point, a starting point that I start only with the people who confess agnosticism. Just with, let's start with making no claims at all, and then find out to how far you can go with me in making the claims I propose.
Okay, thank you very much. I also have a question about the transition from the second to the third circle from the outside. Moral people is within all people. Moral people is the first subcategory, and then religious people. And I wonder whether that's adequate. I was thinking of Søren Kierkegaard's treatment of Abraham, who is faced with sacrificing his son, and has enormous tension between a moral point of view and his religious point of view, whether to obey God or, as he sees it, or to, well, reject sacrificing a child. So it seems to me that treating the religious as if it's a subcategory enclosed within the moral seems to be, well, a very particular and limited view of religion, unless you would like to say that Abraham is not a religious person. But I find that a somewhat implausible position. So, yeah.
What Kaufman is arguing is that there are basically two possibilities to first discuss religious doctrine and then discuss ethics, or do it the other way around. And there are very good reasons to do it, to do first doctrine, because in the Bible, for example, God is there from Genesis 1, and the basic for the ethics is coming in when Moses receives the Ten Commandments. But Kaufman says, well, that is not a proper way to do, because if you start with God in the global discussion about religion, then you will not then we will not conclude, because there are many people who can know nothing with God. And then you miss the most urgent point. And the most urgent point is that we're responsible people, that we want to live well and live a good life. And for that reason, Kaufman said that you have to start with morality, and only after you have set the boundaries, you can look for inspiration within those moral boundaries. And it will not surprise you that the Bible text you quote, I have very many difficulties with that. Because a God which poses you with those requirements, which is not moral, is not the kind of God I would like to consider for my religion. But luckily, I'm not a Christian, so I don't have that problem.
No, but I think your answer affirms for me that the step towards religious people is not really about all religious people. It's already about very liberal religious people who are willing to say my religion is restricted to what is moral. And many others are already left aside in a sense.
Yeah, that may be a very interesting command. Yeah, I think I have to agree with you there.
Then also about transition from moral to religious. In the text, at next page, you speak about the choice to be religious or spiritual. And the word choice was standing out for me. Long ago, I read a book by a Dutch lawyer, Abel Herzberg, a Jewish lawyer, Letters to My Grandson. And there he speaks of a person he speaks of fairly Orthodox Judaism background, of someone who's religious, not as a choice, but like someone can be musical because a song rises in him. And I wonder whether this emphasis on language of choice is not also, well, in a sense, misguided on human identity. And when it's about the next circle, the liberals, there too, even I wonder whether being religious is a matter of choice in this intellectual sense of, well, you choose your wife, your partner, by making a list of pros and contras, and then you come to a conclusion. It's far more something that happens to you, and that has a strong affective dimension. So I wonder about whether the language of choice is really adequate, whether you can explain that.
Yeah, in this sense, my thinking is very Kaufmanian. And Kaufman states that there may impinge all kinds of things on us, but it is always our interpretation whether we go with it or assign the word God to it or not. So the impingement which comes from outside may be something you cannot influence, but the interpretation is always a choice. And my interpretation to say, well, it may be that I come across in life something which say, well, that may be religious, but whether I say yes to that interpretation of what is happening is my choice. That would be Kaufman's answer, I think, and I agree very much with that.
Okay, there's still some time. Yeah. Later, you discuss Kaufman's position and some criticisms. And the first one you discuss as criticism is by Garrett Green and Douglas Otati. And I was very surprised because I know both. And Douglas Otati is an outspoken liberal theologian, and it didn't seem to match. And then I went back to the original, which you referred to. And there are two reviews, actually. And there are two different articles. One has the name Green and the other has the name Otati. And Otati writes, in some intelligible, imaginative constructives, writing about Kaufman, are practically indicated and theoretically permissible. So he seems to agree, in a sense, basically with Kaufman's line. So I was puzzled. Why do you attribute the criticism to both?
That is a very difficult question because I have to remember exactly what is there, and I do not know it a bit hard. But I would have to look up what is actually there to see how I could answer this question.
He doesn't use the word idolatry, for instance, whereas Green does use the word idolatry. So it seems to me, well, that the difference is more significant than
given the time. I would suggest that you follow up on this conversation after the ceremony, so that we can now continue with the next opponent. And the next opponent is one out of the three next opponents who will join us through Zoom. Professor Mark Haim is Samuel Abbott Professor of Christian Theology, Andover Newton Seminary at Yale Divinity School. Professor Haim, it's good to have you with us online. We don't see you yet, but yes, here you are. Here you all are. Professor Haim, the floor is yours. Thanks for participating in this ceremony. And I think you're still muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Now you're there. Now you're there.
Excellent. Thank you very much for the honor of participating in this event. Esteemed candidate, it's a pleasure to see my own work used in such a thoughtful and constructive project as your own. Nevertheless, on the authority of the rector and by virtue of my right as an objector, I'd like to question you about a few things. The first has to do with your discussion of the acceptance model and my own work and the work of Nicholas Rescher. You say on page 205 that one of the disadvantages of a view like my own is that the choice of religious ends is a global decision from my perspective, because religious ends are comprehensive and come as a necessary package with an entire religious tradition. I hope I'm accurately describing what you say about me. And my question to you has to do with a concern that you don't maybe take entirely into account for your own project this idea of religious ends, which I think is not limited to traditions as they come off the shelf, so to speak, as comprehensive ends themselves, but they also can have to do with a kind of intrinsic dynamic, what I would call, maybe using Rescher's term, aporetic religious lifestyles, which is to say, I take it one of your points is that religious ends or goals don't just come in single comprehensive packages given by historical traditions. They can be adopted in a rather ad hoc way by seekers, doing it piece by piece, one at a time. So, for instance, someone might seek a better rebirth in their next life, and they might also seek as another end healing for some physical infirmity or difficulty they have, and they might seek as another end the appropriate diet to follow in accordance with what they take to be their moral and spiritual values. And they might pursue as another end a particular form of family structure for their own intimate life. All of these things could be adopted as a kind of ad hoc combination of different goals. But it seems to me that adds up to a kind of pattern of goal seeking that is a form of life in itself, a religious form of life, for want of a better term. So my first question is simply, is that encompassed in your understanding of what the acceptance model, the religious ends discussion is addressing? Because it seems to me that's highly relevant to to your proposal, but it's not really articulated by you.
Learned opponent. If I remember your work correctly at this moment, what you say is about religious ends is that there are many signs on the road, but for each religious end it's indicated how to go. So if you follow a sign in a certain direction, towards a certain religious end, you cannot follow the alternative route anymore. And if I summarize your work correctly again, which please let me know if that's not the case, those decisions are comprehensive in that sense that it is a set of practices, a set of ideas which together determine your whole lifestyle. And that is, in that way, I deviate from your view, where I say, well, it is not about choosing a religious end first, but it's about which is linked to a certain tradition, or not linked to a certain tradition, because the religious end could be in the middle. But it is about every time again on a crossroad, say, okay, now I have several options again. I can go left, I can go right, and at that moment I pragmatically anew start to choose, rather than seeing at the beginning of my walk, okay, I'm going to follow those signs and I'm not going to follow the other signs. Would that answer your question?
I think you accurately describe a description of existing traditional notions of religious ends, but I discuss in my work the idea that within any cultural context, one could pursue a number of different ends, even conflicting ones. So my real question is not that, yes, you well described the top-down version of life guided by a forechosen religious end. But what about the bottom-up process by which people, in effect, are choosing different kinds of ends and assembling them, which seems to me very consistent with your general outlook, so that there is, if you adopt a particular end for a particular goal, you have chosen a one-way sign just for that particular purpose. And now you add to that another one-way sign about another, let's say, your diet decisions and so on. Can't one proceed in that kind of ends-related reflection on religious practice?
I think I agree very much with your bottom-up approach. And the question is, so you at every cross point on the road, you start again, well, like Rescher is suggesting, to investigate, to gather the data first, gather the insights, understand them, then make a weakest link analysis, and then go for your decision. Then you can, of course, sometimes, most of the time, you go left or you go right. Sometimes, like Rescher says, as a kind of rest category, you have to live with that there are different outcomes, that you realize that you can go left, and that may be a worthy way to live, or also go right for a worthy way to live. Most of the cases, Rescher claims, the weakest link analysis will suggest, by means of an evaluative judgment, which way to go. So indeed, that is the way to go, and not the other one. Not because the one is right and the other is not right, because in that sense, Rescher is very much a pluralist, so there could be also other exits, but because my pragmatic judgment let me go in this direction and not in the other. On the other hand, there is still this rest category where we just maybe for the moment have to pick something, but not knowing whether that will be the right way to go. Does that answer your question?
I think it's very helpful. I mean, I think that one could say that a seeker is building a religious lifestyle, and this has less to do with decisions, right? Decisions about ultimate realities or even permanent convictions, but it is very much a step-by-step process of choosing this and then that, which I would say adds up to a pattern that has an implicit, intrinsic teleology, whether or not the person wants to affirm that teleology in any kind of abstract or ultimate sense. So let me shift my question a little bit and turn it the other way around. I'm wondering whether a seeker, following your theology, in what ways can a seeker violate the paradigm that you've set out for them? A theologian of a certain type could lose their faith, which would mean that they would no longer use certain sources of authority in their theological instruction. It would become problematic to pursue their theological method given the change. And I'm wondering whether a seeker can attain stability in some area which makes the theological searching method no longer relevant to them. Can you lose your instability on a particular locus that now means somehow the system doesn't work for you anymore?
Yeah, may I ask you to give a concise reply?
The answer is definitely a yes, because you can be overwhelmed by a religious inspiration in such a way that you choose the Kaufman, the Orthodox package rather than the Kaufman package, either for a specific theological question or for in a kind of general way. So in that sense, the answer is yes.
Thank you. Then the conversation will continue with Professor Janine Diller, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy and Religious Studies at the University of Toledo. Welcome to this ceremony at this early hour of your place, and the floor is yours. Please go ahead. And we cannot hear you because you're still mute.
Even after COVID?
Yeah, thank you. Great. This is it.
Thank you very much, Rector, and good morning, Hans. And thank you for such an amazing first go, I think, in the world on establishing and writing seeker theology. I think this is just tremendous constructive work, and welcome to the party. You have really earned a right to join the academic community, in my view, and have done so with a really fantastic first offering to us. So thank you. On the authority of the rector and in virtue of my right, I do want to ask a question or two about the thesis. And it's actually picking up some on the discussion that you were just closing with Dr. Heim. So one of the ideas that I was really struck with and introduced to by your thesis was the idea of deliberately leaving certain topics unstable, which I think is simply epistemically honest, especially for a seeker to do. And I think it's honest when you are in a position of equipoise, by which I mean when you've looked at the arguments for a view and the arguments against a view, and you find yourself stumped because they seem to you equally persuasive. And Hume has talked about this, David Hume, as sort of a whimsical condition of humanity, that we are often in equipoise about the things that matter most to us. And I love how you've articulated various topics about which we might be in equipoise. And I think at many points, as a seeker myself, I have been in equipoise about many and still are in equipoise about some of these topics. But what I kept puzzling over and what I would like for you to help me understand is how you can know in advance which topics a seeker will be or must be in equipoise about, given that the search is an open-ended search for truth. And you can never, if it's truly open-ended, know in advance when you might find it.
Learned opponent, thank you for this very interesting question. In a way, I think that it is not possible to know upfront which topics to stabilize and which not. And it may be very much dependent on the individual seeker how this will go through in your life. If you have a strong religious experience of the divine spirit, you probably stabilize the concept of God. Or if you have a very strong concept of afterlife, you will probably stabilize that concept. From that perspective, I've just made a step back and said, well, okay, those individual routes leading to individual stabilizations will be there, and I have to respect that. But theologically, I can consider it from a distance and say, well, for some topics like ethics or so like truth, I do think that all religious seekers have reason to stabilize them, because it is a necessary thing to include to be a seeker. While others, like the ones I should just suggested, I can very well accept that for some religious seekers, they will stabilize that. But from a general seeker perspective, I do not see a reason. And if I would go that route and do that, I would lose a lot of seekers who do not want to stabilize those topics. Does it answer your question?
So let me see if I can understand what you just said. So the idea is that it's a condition of being a seeker that I believe in truth, that I'm open to multiple religions, that I'm ready for growth, and that I'm interested in morality. And so those, in virtue of my identity as a seeker, I have to stabilize those topics. And once, let's say I decide, I believe in those guys who think that there is no truth, that it's just an instrumental concept in language, then I've just dropped off the seeker wagon. Is that the idea?
I have a bit of trouble of hearing what you exactly said, but probably the answer is yes.
Well, it's important to me to understand, but the idea, I guess, is that there are things that qualify you to be a seeker. And they are the 4 things that you indicate you must be stable about. Is that right?
Yeah, that is right. Yes.
Okay. And if I decide that I don't believe in one of those things, then I thereby am no longer a seeker. Is that right?
No, yeah, my theology is a proposal, of course, for a coherent way to consider seekerism. But it does not exclude that there are other ways to support being a religious seeker. For some, I think if you are consistently choosing the orthodox package, yeah, I think it is very difficult to be a religious seeker. If you choose for your morality one specific thing, like you say, well, everything, if you do not follow the 5 columns of the Islam, that is just wrong, then it turns out to be more difficult to be a seeker. But I cannot exclude that there are human images, for example, or world images, which also support a seeker view.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So there's going to be your kind of seekerism, but there could be other varieties of seekers out there who break your rules.
Yeah, in that sense, I would say this is just a theology, which means like there are many Christian theologies which are different. So this is my proposal, and there could be a different one as well. Yeah, it would be very interesting to hear and to discuss. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. So, but on the converse, what if I stabilize one of the things that you say I need to keep unstable? Like, let's say in my search for truth, I have some profound experience that makes me believe in an afterlife and maybe even be able to describe it a bit. Do I lose my seeker status if I decide to keep that stable now in light of that I'm no longer in equipoise because this side just got stronger than this side was. And I know there's this risk, like you say, of losing the other voice. I understand that. But sometimes the search for truth warrants losing the other voice because that's precisely what we're doing. We're precisely weighing two sides, or sometimes 3 or 4 or 5 sides, and deciding which side is the most important to us or the most convincing. And I can even maybe use logical forms of validity and soundness to decide if it's more convincing or not. And that's precisely this philosophical path, at least there's so many paths, a philosophical path to reaching truth is sort of empty if you're going to say, hey, I'm never allowed to decide about the afterlife because I have to keep it unstable. The whole point is to become stable about whatever we can become stable about. I'm so happy to say, wow, it's so great to own our instabilities, but we can't lose sight of the whole point being to become stable when we can, when we honestly can, maybe based on our experience, which was rule number 5, I think, on the seeker path, or the rules that you came up with really beautifully. So is that legal? Can I become stable about something that you've deemed I should not become stable about?
In my introduction, I have sketched the kind of orthodox as opposed to a seeker, which I say, well, both extremes do not exist. And the orthodox, extremely orthodox would be to stabilize everything, and the extremely religious seeker would be to stabilize nothing. And I suggest, well, that is not a thing what neither of them works. So every religious position has to be somewhere in the middle, where for some people the orthodox side is dominant, and for other people the religious seeker side is dominant. But that in itself is probably already a new way to approach the problem. But what I do actually in my thesis is make suggestions where to stabilize and make suggestions where not to stabilize. But also saying, well, for individual religious seekers, especially, it would be more possible to be more stable in some issues which they have a strong experience about, and that is perfectly fine. You can be stable about believing in God, and be unstable in how to get inspiration about God. That's very feasible.
I don't want to destabilize the conversation, but I would like to turn to the next opponent, if you don't mind. And the conversation will continue with Professor John Thatamanil, who is Professor of Theology and World Religions at Union Theological Seminary in New York. Professor Thatamanil, thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Mr. Rector and colleagues and esteemed candidate, it is an honor to be with you. And as Dr. Heim mentioned, I too am pleased by the creative and substantive use made of my work. And about that, I might have time to ask some questions. But by virtue, let me find the particular formulation here again. On the authority of the rector and by my right, I do have some critical questions. And I'd like to pose perhaps the most significant one first, and then if time permits, get to others. My fundamental question has to do with a claim that you make about yourself and Gordon Kaufman. You write, and I quote you, when others speak of their experience of God or God's presence or the profound experience of the holy or of sacredness, we simply do not know what they are talking about. And you say that you share, both you and Kaufman share, to use, I think, an expression someone else, perhaps William James used, about being unmusical towards religious experience. My question is, why pick a thinker that is unmusical towards religious experience when the commitment to a depth of religious experience seems to be precisely what animates a great many seekers? That is to say, it feels to me that there is a mismatch between your shared reluctance to credit religious experience as a serious source, including the ways in which Dr. Diller just spoke of it, right? That there may be experiences that are so decisive for a particular person that they actually do resolve what was previously unstable. So it seems to me that perhaps you would have done better to choose a thinker that compensates or corrects for your lack of musicality with respect to religious experience, particularly because the audience for whom you write seems particularly committed to taking a variety of religious experiences seriously. So I wonder what your thoughts are about that.
Learned opponent, thank you for your very interesting question. What you just quoted is literally a quote from Kaufman. And I think what he means by saying that is that that he did not have an experience which forced him to accept an image of God, to consider an image of God to be the real God. As in some of the literature of Kaufman, he makes a distinction between God the symbol and the real God. And if he says, well, I do not know what it means to experience God, then he says, I interpret him as saying, I do not have an experience of which I convinced that this is the real God. And that is what I share. But I am convinced that there are a lot of things impinging on both Kaufman and me that inspire us and make us think and make us consider and may us evaluate and reevaluate what kind of symbols of God are relevant for us.
Am I overstating?
Yeah, maybe going to the second part of your question. There will be religious seekers who very much have an overwhelming experience of what they address with the real God for them. And that will be, going back to the discussion I had with Dr. Diller, points at the fact that those religious seekers in certain religious questions will not be seeker at all, but stabilize. But maybe in other fields, they again are open. So it is not to close the possibility for stabilization, because there were very much reasons why individual seekers may do so. But it is about the question: do you want to stabilize or not? Is your experience of the divine that overwhelming that you do want to stabilize it or not?
All right, I'm willing to live with that for the moment. I wonder if there isn't an allied question here also. I think Professor Alma also has this question, but it's not the one that he that is meant that Professor Alma means to ask. I wonder if you overdraw the distinction between the safe haven of tradition and the unsafety of the religious quest. This language occurs fairly routinely, both in your writing and this morning as well. I wonder if this isn't entirely rather overdrawn. And I think you are aware that you might be overdrawing it. What I mean is that in appealing to my work, you rightly show that no religious tradition is an interpretive scheme. So there isn't a kind of settled scheme within any particular tradition. And you're rather good about using my work to show that. I think you do it with great care. But if that's true, then it would seem that no tradition is unified. And then I wonder how you can keep speaking about the Orthodox package, because you yourself show rather skillfully that there is no Orthodox package, but really a discourse for carrying out a conversation. So am I right to see that there's a certain instability in your work of an unproductive kind? That is, you overdraw the distinction between the safe Orthodox package and the unsafe path pursued by the seeker.
Thank you. Very interesting question, which requires a bit more thinking than I can just do here on the spot, probably. But let me say that if I talk about safe haven, that safe haven does not necessarily mean that that is not necessarily linked to a tradition. And my personal spirituality can be a safe haven if it is a seeker theology. So in that sense, yeah, this needs very careful separation, and of course it is again a spectrum, where again you every time you can wonder how safe should it be, and where should I be uncomfortable to keep my own mind, my own spirituality sharp.
Okay, that helps. That clarifies some of the terms. But I still think the way you characterize traditions is marked by a internal contradiction between recognizing the traditions as much more fluid and unsettled. And then there are other times when you do speak of traditions as marked by a greater sense of you routinely speak of them as integral wholes, for example, and I don't think they really are, and you know that they're not. So I think we will need to carry on this conversation.
Yes, I think that is correct, and I do think that we need to do that at another moment, unfortunately, because I would like to turn now to the final opponent who is present here in the room, Professor Hans Alma, who is Professor of Spiritual Care and Religious Humanism at this university. Professor Alma, fire away.
Thank you. Esteemed candidates, let me first congratulate you with your original study into a field of relevance that is executed consistently with the methodology of Kaufman as a starting point, and this offers interesting insights. On the authority of the rector and by virtue of my right, I would like to discuss the following issue with you. In explaining the approach of Kaufman, you stress that the specification of his view of the world and the construction of the concept of God cannot be done separately. In order to help humanity with orientation and guidance, both concepts, world and God, have to be developed as one coherent whole. Starting from this assumption, Kaufman asks a Christian to decide for 6 steps of faith. These 6 steps are about human life, human historical existence, and humanization, which makes Kaufman's view of the world rather anthropocentric. However, you criticize Kaufman for neglecting the role of the individual at the expense of the cultural. You state that this is strange if one notices that the role of the individual is explicit or implicit everywhere in Kaufman's theology. By emphasizing this, you seem to move even further away from a relational view of the world that takes the interdependence of all forms of being into account. This is an important point, for Kaufman is influenced by pragmatism, a philosophical school which does offer such a relational view of the world. You seem to move away from this important influence in the work of Kaufman when you propose to see the human as a biohistorical individual instead of a biohistorical being. I think this is a pity, for it doesn't do justice to the relational dimension of Kaufman's position, a dimension that might be very important when it comes to the search of contemporary religious seekers. Why this separation between the human individual and other forms of being, between world and human life? You state that your choice to see the world as the environment for life, and human life in particular, has ecological implications, as it implies protecting and defending the world. This reminds me of the traditional view, Christian view of stewardship, whereas a really ecological view would stress the entanglement of all forms of worldly being, instead of seeing the world merely as an environment. To summarize, in your construction of a theology of religious seekers, you choose for an anthropocentric, at least in my view, you choose for an anthropocentric and individualistic position and introduce the religious seeker as an individual separated from the world that approaches religion intentionally, rationally, and functionally. Is this really the way of relating to the world that needs to be supported in our challenging times? And haven't you missed an opportunity to strengthen the more relational dimension inherent in Kaufman's view?
Learned opponent. There is a clear, Kaufman is indeed very clear about the idea that a view of the world and a view of God needs to be constructed together. And I agree that there I deviate from Kaufman, if only because, well, not in that sense that the world is for me an unstable topic. Only with the purpose of developing an ethics, say there is reason to select among all those relevant pictures of the views of the world, to select one, which is the environment for life and human life in particular, to select that one as normative. And for the rest, it is an open, but more in general, it's an unstable topic. While God, for me, is also, or ultimate reality, I should say, is also an unstable topic. Because and that is necessary that both are unstable, because I see all kinds of relevant images of the world and all kinds of images of God or ultimate reality, which I consider very relevant and informative for my being as a human. So there indeed, where I leave Kaufman to a certain extent. At least Kaufman could say, well, about the world, there is not too much difference between Kaufman and me. About God, there's definitely, because Kaufman makes a very stable proposal for a view of God, which is linked, which he argues is linked to his view of the world as an environment for life. And I'm not going with him there.
But if I may clarify my question, it's not so much about this difference between world and God and your difference with Kaufman there. It's more about the view of the world. You say the ethical position you choose there is an ecological one, but in fact, I see in your position of the world as an environment for life and human life in particular, a very traditional Christian position of stewardship, where humans have to take care of the world. Whereas in a really ecological position, which is very much implied in the pragmatism of John Dewey, there's really an interdependence between humans and other forms of being, which I miss totally in your point of view.
That is possible, but it still leaves the interpretation open. Like if I say, well, I gave a couple of examples in my thesis that maybe the Christian view is the 3-story building of heaven, hell, and earth, and that is the context of life and human life in particular. It may also be that the world is the totality of old intertwining life, and as such is the environment for life and human life in particular. So I would not say that the interpretation of the world as a totality of intertwining life is excluded. I would say it is included, and it is one of the options in considering the world and being and as such being an unstable topic.
But if we go back to the steps you say a religious seeker has to decide for to be a religious seeker, you state very clearly that the human is seen as a biohistorical individual instead of a biohistorical being. So there is a certain dichotomy within the steps a religious seeker has to take to be a religious seeker. And that for me, as a religious seeker, would be very difficult to accept.
It's a huge discussion, which is by Kaufman, but also others, which I mentioned in my thesis, Cummings Neville and some others, about whether to include that individuality or not. Kaufman is very strong in opposing it. There are others who are very strong and say, well, no, it must be the individual. And I argue I cannot decide in that decision. And therefore, I have to include both the cultural aspect and the individual aspect. And it may be up to the individual where to have the emphasis.
I still wonder whether we have to see the individual so much as an individual, rational human being instead of an earthling, as Bruno Latour would call it, who is really interrelated with other forms of being. So my position is not that we should use both the individual and the cultural. That is not opposed to your position. But I think we should really take care to not see human beings as so excluded from the rest of the world.
I would agree with that. So, now that my defense has ended, I sincerely thank the opponents for the attention they have devoted to my thesis. I now look forward to the decision of the Doctoral Examination Committee in the Faculty of Religion and Theology, which will decide whether the degree of doctor will be granted to me.
I hereby adjourn the public meeting of the Doctoral Examination Committee of the Faculty of Religion and Theology for further deliberation. Yeah. Please be seated. I reopen the public session. By its duly accorded authority, the Doctoral Examination Committee of the Faculty of Religion and Theology grants the degree of Doctor of Philosophy to Hans Legrand. I invite the supervisors and co-supervisor, although Professor McCannon is not here, to place their signatures on the degree certificate as witness of this deed. Whereafter, Professor Marianne Moyaert, appointed by the College of Deans as supervisor, will perform the investiture. I declare in public that in the privacy of the closed session, the candidate, by a signature, stated adherence to the conditions laid down in the provisions in Article 5 of the doctoral regulations of this university regarding rights and responsibilities in society and science. I now request colleague Marianne Moyaert to resume the ceremony, and during the ceremony of the investiture, only the members of the Doctoral Examination Committee stand.
By the virtue of the authority vested in me by the statute of the Vrije Universiteit, and as supervisor appointed thereto by the College of Deans, I hereby confer on you, Hans Legrand, the degree of Doctor of Philosophy, together with all rights, privileges, and responsibilities thereto appertaining. In witness thereof, the seal of the university and the signatures of the rector and the supervisors have been affixed to the diploma you are about to receive.
I now invite Professor Chris Douder van Troostwijk, supervisor, to give the laudatio.
Dear audience, dear Hans, dear Doctor. In his book on rhetoric, Quintilian claims that a good laudatio, should have both a quantity effect and a quality effect. To arrive there, he recommends two techniques. The orator, that's not me, should amplify the merits of a person, amplificare, and embellish his character, ornare. But in your case, I am afraid I will not be able to do so. So let me explain why. Let me start with the quantitative amplification. How should I amplify what speaks for itself? Like, for instance, your double doctor title. And how to amplify your first thesis on experimental physics that you so kindly offered to me and that's still on my nightstand. So now and then I open it, but I close it immediately after. That's pure self-defense. The numbers and the formulas in this work are dazzling, too dazzling for me at least. Dazzling is also your personal biography. You worked on mathematics, on physics, on ethics and financial modeling, on pastoral care, liberal theology, Unitarian Buddhism, and so forth and so on. Nothing to amplify here. You are what they call in French a touche-à-tout, someone who touches about everything, upon everything. So I think your case, your particular case, would have inspired our old friend Quintilian to invent a new rhetorical technique, not laudatio by augmentation, by amplificare, but laudatio by contractio. Contractio, contractio, stems from the Latin verb contractare, which means to collect, to concentrate, but also to touch upon. So you are touche-à-tout. But as you know, in philosophy, there is no passage from quantity to quality. At least that's a problem. And yet, with this contractio, the quantitative amplification organically leaps over into qualitative ornamentation. Hegel, my old enemy, and maybe your old friend, Hegel would have been satisfied. And let me show why. For this second thesis, I prefer to call it, we don't have it in Holland, but I prefer to call it a habilitationsschrift because it's the second one. For this habilitationsschrift, you dared to write a readable work, even readable for me. No numbers, no schemes, no graphics, and I admire that courage that you have. But what personally impressed me much more is your characteristics, your optimism, your youthfulness, your intellectual freshness. Note that this is not rhetorical Quintilian ornatio. It's simply factual observation. Ornaments are added from the outside, but your friendly character is in itself, it is its own ornament. So Quintilian, again, would have had to invent a new way of paying homage, of laudare. And that he would probably have called with a Latin neologism, floratio. Your research has been a process of blossoming. I saw you flourishing from curious erring to focused seeking. And I saw you finding yourself, paradoxically, finding yourself as someone who is seeking. That's what I like, finding seekers. Dear Hans, because it is not possible and therefore not necessary even to honor you, I'll have to interrupt my Quintilian laudatio here. This book of you, I'm sure it will open new job opportunities for you, but then that will not be for its content alone. It will so because quantitatively and qualitatively, it is, to quote Albert Schweitzer, it is your life that is your argument. And that life argument turned this laudatio into a catastrophe. A laudatio turned upside down. You are not honored, but I am honored. And I'm sure my colleagues, Marianne, Moyart, and then McCann, he is not there. We are, and we were honored that you allowed us to contribute a little bit to your life trajectory, to that floraison of your personal credo, searching in face of mystery.
To the congratulations of your supervisors, I gladly add the congratulations of the College of Deans of this university. And I allow myself to say that I think there is some consistency in your work. The first dissertation being in the field of experimental physics, and now you have invented the field of experimental theology. Congratulations. And I would like to congratulate not just you, but also your loved ones and the people you brought here. The doctoral examination ceremony of this afternoon is now completed. Dr. Legrand will lead the procession out of this hall, and I invite you to follow him and us outside to the reception area. I would like to ask you to rise. By pronouncing the doxology, I would like to close this public session of the Doctoral Examination Committee of the Faculty of Religion and Theology. May our search for truth and wisdom be of service to the flourishing of the world and humankind.
I suspect we can take our leave now.